Today, our presentation topic is about how agricultural revolution can affect human society until 2100.
We decided to focus on agriculture, as I believe this was arguably the development that shaped the trajectory of human history more than any other human innovation. And this is something we talked about in class, but I don't really think it can be overstated how much the domestication of plants and animals has fed into so many aspects of human life throughout history. So I'll be discussing the role of agriculture in the preliminary foundations of civilization, as well as its role in the formation of political, economic, and religious institutions, all of which are foundational to today's modern society. The earliest agricultural practices were thought to have begun between roughly 10 and 20,000 years ago, during a period of time where humans were still largely nomadic and largely without the same enforced hierarchical structures we associate with developed civilization, although that's not to say that they had no hierarchies at all. But when the production of food begins, rather than its procuration from the surrounding environment, humans begin to shape their environments in a way that incentivizes sedentary communities settled around sites of food production, a gradual but dramatic shift from the entire way of life that much of the species had shared up until this point. Groups developed different methods of generation, storage, and preservation, which for the first time enabled relatively consistent surpluses of food. This meant that populations were able to grow at a previously unprecedented rate, and furthermore that individuals could adopt specialized roles that weren't necessarily related to food production. The larger populations and the capacity to divide labor fostered innovation at scales that weren't previously possible. Farming could be made more efficient with irrigation technologies, food processing techniques like milling or fermentation, diversified diets compared to the earliest stages of agricultural practice, food preservation methods improved, and more complex architecture emerged in order to facilitate the functions of an increasingly complex society, which is where the rise of the first urban centers can be observed, like those found in ancient Mesopotamia, because of the structural changes brought about by agriculture. Some scholars even theorize that the origin of the urban center and state structure lies specifically in the implementation of large irrigation systems, often called the hydraulic hypothesis, although this theory is contested. Regardless, without the widespread adoption of farming and domestication, it's likely that large-scale civilizations either would not exist or at least would not exist until much later in history, as it was the agricultural revolution that enabled the urban revolution. It also enabled the existence of an economy. Labor specialization meant that commodities were being produced that were not vital for subsistence, like artisan and luxury goods, and surplus meant that preserved foods could be preserved for a population even in times when farming wasn't possible, but also that goods were available for trade at a scale not precedented at the time, both within a community or with outside groups, which incentivized contact between different groups of people, each with their own specializations. This contact facilitated the exchange of not just material goods, but also information, promoting the spread of new farming techniques, crops, and tools. Even the trade of non-subsistence goods like copper or bronze could still be linked back to farming practices, as they were popular in part because of their suitability for farming tools. So the earliest economic systems, even the first writing systems like the cuneiform used in ancient Mesopotamia to record information on agricultural surplus and trade exchanges, and some of the first representational currencies like the clay tokens that were thought to be exchanged for stored resources at temples, existed because of the popularization of farming. Of course, political systems developed in complexity as trade and civilization itself did, and these two were largely rooted in food production. The exact origins of these systems are debated, though. Under the hydraulic hypothesis I mentioned, demand for more centralized, formalized leadership would have stemmed from the need to manage water resources and coordinate the construction of large-scale irrigation systems. Sometimes collaboration between multiple communities and villages was required for this, necessitating a more overarching authority, which might have been the case for early Mesopotamian states that relied on irrigation for farming in a hot, dry climate. Other scholars argue that surplus or storage methods enabled more complex hierarchies, increased social stratification, and exacerbated the uneven distribution of food and resources due to non-producing elites' abilities to sequester surpluses away from the producing population and exploit that population for labor. For example, in early Egyptian states, the presence of surplus and the seasonal nature of farming meant that laborers could be put to other tasks, like the construction of large architectural projects during off-seasons, making them subservient to a political elite. Surplus and land ownership also made taxation possible, initially paid in grains, and was another way to widen wealth and status gaps. Resource-rich decision-makers were the orchestrators of early states and eventually formed more centralized, autocratic political systems that used hierarchical frameworks to organize labor and manage resources, and the continued existence of those political systems required ongoing agricultural surplus. Religion does predate the advent of agriculture by thousands of years, thought to have developed as a means to promote cooperation and pass along environmental information, but agriculture completely changed how it manifested in society. Religion continued to function as a vehicle for information, transmitting agricultural knowledge about seasonal changes and planting cycles, as seen with the Greek mythology surrounding Persephone and Demeter, or the frequent mentions of agriculture in the Old Testament. As societies became stationary and political systems developed, religion became involved in the management and distribution of surplus resources, and temples often acted as food stores, something that gave religious leaders significant power and influence. In some civilizations, religious organizations had close relationships with political leaders, and in others, the leader himself would use divine authority to legitimize control over land and resources. Furthermore, agricultural societies that had grown larger and more complex were more likely to develop interventionist big gods and routinized rituals, thought to be due to the ease of spreading practices among more dense populations and the need to enforce collective morality and encourage the labor necessary for large-scale farming. In those ways, agriculture development laid the groundwork for the formation of organized and globalizing religions. Ultimately, the course of human history can't be attributed to any one development. There are obviously many nuanced factors at play, but my argument is that agriculture in some way shaped or created those major factors. As history progresses and societies become more complex, agriculture has become less of a central focus in political and economic systems, but is still prevalent in different ways and will arguably become a more pressing political and economic topic in the near future.
After more than 11,000 years since the first agricultural revolution, the world experienced a second one starting in the 1500s and continuing until around 1850. It began in Britain, where people sought new ways to increase productivity on the land. From there, it spread across Europe and then to the rest of the world. This revolution brought major changes. New high-yield crops like wheat were introduced. Farmers began using chemical fertilizers, machine selective breeding, and energy-intensive practices. Agriculture was no longer just about feeding families, but had economic, political, social, and cultural changes. These are some key impacts. First is increased agricultural production and population growth. Between 1700 and 1870, total agricultural output grew by about 2.7 times. This surplus in food supported massive population growth. For instance, in England and Wales, the population increased from 5.5 million to over 9 million in just a century. Second is the commercialization of agriculture. With more surplus to sell, agriculture shifted from subsistence to profit. Farming was no longer just a way to survive, but it had become a business. This change helped dismantle the old feudal system and gave rise to capitalist farming. In response, the governments introduced policies like enclosure, which restricted land access to private owners. At the same time, privatization spread, creating an economic gap between landowners who grew wealthier and small farmers who were pushed out. Third is the flourishing of trade. Commercial agriculture led to a rise in trade. Farmers could now sell their goods far beyond their local markets. Government supported this with new infrastructure such as roads, railways, and canals, which increased connectivity and reshaped communities through economy. Fourth is the Industrial Revolution. The second agricultural revolution also played a major role in triggering the Industrial Revolution. As capitalist farming grew, many people lost their land and livelihoods, pushing them into cities in search of work. This rural to urban migration created a surplus labor force for factories. Industry grew, production became more efficient, and population growth accelerated even further. But this shift had some negative impacts as well. Fossil fuel use in agriculture introduced early environmental problems. Traditional village life weakened and cities expanded rapidly, bringing both modern life as well as serious challenges like slums, crime, and social inequality. In short, this revolution transformed agriculture into a market-driven system, increased food supply, promoted urbanization, restructured society, and laid the foundation for modern capitalism. It helped shape the globalized, city-based world we live in today. Fast forward to the 20th century, and we arrive at the third agricultural revolution, also known as the Green Revolution. It began around 1950 in North America and quickly spread to Asia, Latin America, and Africa. This revolution was a response to severe food shortages and famine, particularly in places like India. Science and technology played a key role, including irrigation systems, pesticides, genetically modified crops, synthetic farming, and further automation. These are some key impacts of this revolution. First, it achieved its main goal of reducing hunger and malnutrition. Global caloric availability rose by around 12%, and the world population doubled. Between 1961 and 2020, food production per person increased by 53%, and food prices declined globally. It also promoted agribusiness, turning food production into a complex supply chain. However, this also hurt small-scale farmers who struggled to compete. Second, it helped agriculture adapt to climate change. Genetically engineered crops were more resistant to disease and drought. Farms used fewer natural resources per unit of output, making agriculture more efficient and, in some ways, more sustainable. On the other hand, the Green Revolution also had drawbacks. Widespread use of pesticides and fertilizers polluted water and damaged soil. Water-intensive farming has worsened global water scarcity, and also reliance on fossil fuels continues to worsen climate change. Mechanization also replaced farm labor. Today, most farms operate with just 1 to 2 workers. Meanwhile, monoculture became dominant, which caused the extinction or endangerment of traditional rice and wheat varieties, pushing indigenous farming further to the margins. The third agricultural revolution was a continuation of the second. It used science to dramatically boost food production, but at a cost. It introduced new efficiencies and globalized agriculture while also increasing environmental damage and reducing the role of traditional farmers. Together, these revolutions reshaped our world, from feudal villages to global cities and from small farms to industrial agribusiness. And even today, we're living with both the benefits and consequences of those changes.
Now I want to talk about the challenges of agriculture in modern society. So first is the climate change problem. Globally, agri-food systems are responsible for approximately from 25% to 30% of total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, rising to around one-third when including associated land use change and off-farm energy use. The agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector accounted for about 22% of global emissions in 2019. Driven largely by methane and nitrous oxides. In the U.S., agriculture emits roughly around 10 to 11% of national GHGs. So the rising emissions could actually cause intensified climate problems, such as extreme weather events like droughts, heat waves, and floods, which are increasingly common and damaging in the current world. For example, the UK experienced its driest spring in 132 years, halving wheat yields in affected region. A recent global study mapped 16 extreme weather events since 2022 in regions like California, Japan, Mexico, and West Africa, finding direct links to spike food prices. Climate change also could reduce nutritional quality, so the elevated CO2 could lower protein, iron, and zinc in staples like wheat and rice. This could worsen the malnutrition in vulnerable populations. Last but not least is the resource degradation and soil loss problem. So soil health is deteriorating worldwide due to intensive agriculture and erosion, threatening long-term productivity. While rising temperature accelerates decomposition, reducing soil organic content by an estimated 22% over 50 years. So now let's talk about the second challenge, population growth and rising demand pressures. By 2050, global population is expected to approach 10 billion, requiring a 56% increase in food production from 2010. However, arable land per capita continues to shrink. Water stress is growing, particularly in the dry lands, and key resources like phosphate are finite. So then let's talk about the limited resources like water, phosphorus, and plastic. So water scarcity is intensifying in the current society, evidenced by the drought-stricken farming regions from India to the American West. 40% of Earth's land area is now dry lands, up from 30% in 1990. Phosphorus and nutrient depletion threaten long-term fertility of the lands. Meanwhile, agricultural plastic pollution is very severe in the current world. 10 million metric tons of farm plastics are generated annually and poorly managed. Last but not least, I want to talk about unsustainable industrial practices. Modern industrial farming relies heavily on synthetic fertilizers and tillage, contributing to nitrous oxide emissions, nutrients runoff, and water pollution. Methane from livestock and rice cultivation compounds emissions. So now, reform is urgently needed. Additionally, farm energy use like machinery and transports could also add to indirect emissions. So next, let's move on to why agriculture is still a crucial political and economic issue in the future society. First is its political significance. Agriculture is actually very important to national and global stability. Why? Because food insecurity is a powerful trigger of political unrest. For example, the Arab Spring was catalyzed by bread price shocks, and food inflation today is fueling protests from Kenya to Argentina. As climate shocks increase, food insecurity could destabilize multiple regions simultaneously. Secondly, agriculture governs land, water, labor, and genetic resources, all of which are contested in the 21st century. Disputes over water access, seed patenting, or land rights are already politically volatile in countries like India, Brazil, Ethiopia, and the US. Thirdly, is its effect on diplomacy and development aid. So food aid, agriculture knowledge exchange, and rural development projects are key tools of foreign policy. Let's take China as an example. So China's investment in African agriculture has been used to build political alliances and resource exchange. Secondly, let's talk about economic significance. So agriculture contributes about 4% of global GDP, but supports 26.5% of global employment and underpins most of the informal economy in lower income countries. In nations like Ethiopia or Bangladesh, agriculture employs over 60% of the workforce. A World Bank study found that GDP growth from agriculture is 2 to 4 times more effective at reducing poverty than growth in other aspects. Thus, investing in climate resilient agriculture brings massive social economic returns. $10 trillion in health, ecosystem services, and disaster mitigation annually by 2050, predicted by Guardian in 2024. Then let's talk about how it can also benefit innovation and green jobs. So agri-tech like drones, soil sensors, bioengineering, precision farming is a very fast-growing sector. The transition to regenerative agriculture could create millions of green jobs, especially for youth and women in the global south. Thirdly, I want to propose some solutions to elevate agriculture in politics and economics aspects. So first is to have institutional reform. We could embed agriculture in climate and security architecture. So why to do this? It's because agriculture policy now is often separated in the whole system. It is always detached from climate, trade, economic, or security agendas. So what we need to do is to establish interministerial councils merging agriculture, climate, finance, and security to ensure cohesive strategy. We should declare that food systems are as critical as other infrastructure within national security and climate frameworks. We also could embed agriculture in diplomatic agendas at FAO, COP, WTO, these international organizations, and global food systems to ensure balanced trade and sustainability. We could set goals and make a roadmap in the nearest future. These actions could ensure agriculture inform every policy layer, from the foreign aid and trade to green industrial planning. This could deliver consistent and resilient outcomes. Secondly, policymakers should carry out some equity and just transition measures. For example, the policymakers should center smallholders and rural communities together. Why? Because without support, farmers, especially in developing regions, they risk marginalization as transitions accelerate. So what we could do is to fund training, capacity building, and cooperative seed banks. And also, we need to guarantee carbon market access with small share agreements, pool-based participation, and legal safeguards. Also, to ensure inclusive policymaking, people should partner with NGOs and social enterprises, especially involving women and indigenous communities, or other vulnerable groups. Thirdly, we could elevate agriculture by the media and communication. So nowadays, agriculture is often unseen until crises like floods, droughts, or riots hit. So what we could do is to launch campaigns linking food to climate, health, and economic stability. Also, we could use data and farmer stories as popularization to the public to clarify policy stakes. Also, institutionalize food security indices such as resilience scores that ties into budgeting decisions. By doing this, farmers and consumers become political influencers, so they transform agriculture from a marginalized issue to a mainstream policy. Well, additionally, from the economics perspective, we should shift the agriculture system from flat subsidies to performance-based rewards. So globally, governments now allocate over $600 billion per year in agriculture subsidies. Yet most fund status quo production systems that are resource-intensive and emission-heavy. This could actually harm ecological system and excludes innovative practices. So here's what we should do. First, we should recondition subsidies on measurable climate, biodiversity, and resilience metrics such as soil carbon increase and reduce nutrient runoff. Secondly, we could implement some certifications like USDA Climate Smart Seal to signal compliance and incentivize adoption. Moreover, like we mentioned before, we should reallocate EU CAP funds to favor smallholders and climate-smart outcomes. By doing this, we could actually align supports with sustainability. Also, we could have some public goods like creating jobs, restoring resources, and reducing political friction. To add up on it, we also need to unlock public and private capital. So the current state is that agriculture only gets less than 4% of climate finance, leaving massive mitigation potential unharvested. Scientists have advised that we need to expand USDA partnerships for climate-smart commodities, which funded over $3 billion for regenerative pilots. Also, we need to launch agri-climate investment funds via some climate platforms such as Climate Short Investor Coalition. According to The Guardian, people should support voluntary soil carbon credit schemes such as Agrina and to standardize methodologies. Also, from the legislation level, the government should legislate compliance markets for agriculture GHG reductions, akin to forestry offsets. These actions could create direct economic profits for farmers, also mobilizing private investment. This action could actually enhance food security and climate stability. Additionally, we could use technology to reform the agriculture system. So current status is that public R&D for farm resilience has stagnated or declined, according to the recent USDA budget cuts. So what we need to do is to increase global R&D funding, especially for vulnerable groups like small-scale farming projects in drought-prone regions. Also, to deploy precision farming tools like IoT, AI-driven monitoring like satellite soil sensors, and democratize this access for smallholders, which were not available for them before. Also, we need to invest in MRV technologies for reliable carbon accounting. This is to standardize soil carbon verification to satisfy carbon markets. By using the modern technology, productivity can rise while environmental damage can decrease. Last but not least, to tackle with the conventional commodity prices, which is failed to reflect environmental damages, which leads to overuse and pollution, it is recommended that to institutionalize true cost accounting. which means that to introduce carbon pricing or nutrient runoff tariffs for individual operations. Also to implement green public rules favoring sustainable sourcing, to expand border adjustment taxes, penalizing imports producers via unsustainable practices. So by doing this, there's some benefits like price signals align economic incentives with sustainable methods, stimulating demand for green agro practices and reshaping supply chains. Last but not least, I want to talk about some potential measures to revolutionize agriculture to 2100. So first is the Climate Smart Agriculture System, also known as CSA. CSA aims to sustainably increase productivity, enhance resilience, and reduce emissions. So it includes conservation agriculture, agroforestry, and precision nutrient management. However, nowadays, adoption remains uneven, hampered by lack of standards and unequal distribution of benefits. Moreover, World Bank supports CSA. It stresses that food systems drive climate change and require transformation. Also, some regenerative practices, techniques such as no-till, cover cropping, crop rotation, and agroforestry rebuild soil carbon, boost biodiversity, and elevate resilience. So conservation agriculture's 3 pillars, minimal disturbance, cover crops, and crop diversity could help restore degraded land. Moreover, set up soil carbon markets and popularize the concept of carbon credits, which can regenerative farming by strengthening the soil health. And also utilize the power of AI technology, like I mentioned before, the IoT, drones, and satellites technology. Also precise nutrient management and enhance land use and buffers against heat stress to benefit the urban edge and arid zone farming. Nowadays, we all know that genetic innovation could benefit crop breeding, so what we could do in the future is to have biotech developments to enable crop resistance to drought, heat, and reduced nutrient levels. Also, from nowadays, the global organizations has called on the dietary shifts and value chain reform. They recommend people to reduce meat consumption because livestock farming accounts for 14.5% of global GHGs and is the single largest source within agriculture. Plant-based diets can lower emissions and liberate land for restoration. So the establishment of true cost accounting can motivate people to avoid some emission-intensive production. Also, it is necessary for people to cut food waste, reducing logistically losses through cold storage, improved infrastructure, and digital tracking can yield 20 to 30% gains in effectively available food without new land use. That's the end of our presentation, and thank you for listening.